Hi, I'm David Scott Hay, author of The Butcher of Nazareth. Welcome to One Final Twist.
So I'm super excited to get to interview you today and to talk to you about it. In digging and getting ready for this, interviewing these questions, I, of course, am finding that there's more to you than just the author. There's a playwright, a screenwriter, and you have some pretty dark books. Um, you do not shy away from anything, which I think is so brave.
Well, part of that is just, exploring things that interest me and asking questions that I want answers to. I know with a lot of writers, they don't sit down to start a story or a screenplay until they know how it's going to end, or a story until, they have it completely outlined and then they write out the outline. And for me, there's only so much you can discover in an outline where, structurally wise, you can hit certain beats, but it leaves out some opportunities for discovery. And screenplays are much more math, whereas plays, I always say, are more like jazz. You can go on a riff and kind of come back. And I would say novels are probably somewhere in between there.
Tell for those of the people who are watching and listening about the Butcher of Nazareth. So here's my copy.
I know. I saw your annotations. I was like, oh, we should talk. She's got, we should
So
talk.
tell people who haven't seen it what it's about.
The Butcher of Nazareth is a historical fiction that takes place during the year or so before, or right before Jesus starts his ministry. And a butcher 30 years ago, that was his trade, is conscripted into a group called the Black Masks. Because when King Herod found out about the Star of Bethlehem, that a baby had been born that would be eventually become king, he grew jealous and he tasked the three wise men with going and finding this boy and then reporting back. And of course, the three wise men didn't. They showered, baby Jesus with gifts and hightailed it out of there. So when Herod didn't hear back from him, the wise men, he ordered all male children the ages of 2 years and younger in Judea to be slaughtered. And uh, I came up with the term black mask, for that to his group of assassins that would do that. Now, our butcher was conscripted in there against his will, had to make some difficult decisions, and then he self-exiled to Egypt for 30 years. But then he starts having these visions that the child that they went after had escaped the culling, and or I believe it's the massacre of innocence. If you look at some historical biblical books, that's how they refer to it. But it's only mentioned in the book of Matthew. So he gets these visions of all these atrocities that Christ, his followers, not Christ, will do in the future, like the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, and eventually he has these visions of what could be a nuclear war. So he sets out to kind of finish his mission and also look for maybe a little bit of redemption to basically save the land. And so he starts off, basically in Bethlehem. It kind of works his way through the history of Jesus, through the people that knew him through different stages of his life, with the goal of killing him before all these shenanigans can start.
So I'm just going to ask this, and if you want me to cut it out, I'll cut it out. Did you grow up in the church?
I grew up in a church. My grandma was the piano player. I grew up around the religion, but I was always fascinated with it on a more scholarly level. Uh,
Hmm.
One of my first books was Cloning Christ. My first play was Killing Lucifer. So in my 20s, I was reading God, I was reading The Origin of Satan, I was reading The Rise of Christianity. I was reading all these books to try to get a little bit more of a scholarly take um, on how these events kind of came to be or how they're actually kind of parsed. And and honestly, I had kind of I felt like I'd done enough with that material, and I grew interested in other things. And my previous big book was The Fountain, which is a satire on the art world, and then Not Safe for Work. Has to do with social media and tech, and the limits of the human mind and trauma. And this one, um, honestly, this is going to be funny. I I like to experiment with different forms and styles, and this one was originally going to be a cozy mystery. I was going to do a cozy mystery. I kid you not. It was going to be called Nazareth Fine Furniture and Catering, a Mary Magdalene mystery. I may still do it at some point. I started outlining it. I started working because I wanted to play it straight. It's kind of like a Will Ferrell project. Like, I'm going to do this cozy mystery with biblical characters, but I'm going to play it straight. And I'd never written a cozy mystery. I'd read very few of them. And I was just like, oh, this would be a challenge because I want, I teach and mentor occasionally, and it's just another thing for the toolbox. And I was going through the list of possible suspects because I knew Joseph was going to be the murder victim, right? And because Mary at that time was, betrothed to Jesus, Jesus hadn't quite had started his ministry, so he was in and out of town. Uh, Mary Magdalene was going to team up with Margaret and her brother Lazarus, if I recall correctly, and they were going to solve this mystery. So I was brainstorming a list of suspects, and I was like, I need somebody from out of town. Somebody needs to come in, went through town and is maybe an assassin or a spy for something. I don't know. I was just going there. And my wife, who was raised in the Catholic Church, goes, well, in the book of Matthew, they talk about, the massacre of the innocents, which, King Herod decrees that all males 2 and under be slaughtered. And it's only in the book of Matthew. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Suspect number 8 is an assassin. Come back to finish the job, right? And so I'm tinkering more and more, and I started going through, and I had the questions of like, okay, where's he been the last 30 years? Why would he volunteer to do this thing? What are the repercussions of this? And actually, what are the repercussions in Judea of that? Because you have a whole generation of families that, have a gap where there's no children, right?
Mhm.
And then Jesus comes back in his, early teens or so, and has no peers because they've all been killed. And I, it's one of those things when you do enough plays and you do enough screenplays, enough stories, your story brain kicks in and goes, "Hey, idiot, that's your story." And so I put that cozy mystery aside, and I wanted to write about the butcher and his adventure and really explore what was motivating him. So I started. It was really a book of exploration. I wanted to see what kind of character would do this, and I wanted to stick with him closely. Um, and see if I could, make the story work. Wasn't sure where I was going to end the book, where it was going to end up. I didn't know if it was going to be a novella or a novel, but I just kind of started doing a lot of research and started the project. So to answer your question, it was originally a cozy mystery, and my wife gave me a little nugget for one of the suspects, and I was like, well, that's too good because if I'm reading a book and that's a suspect in his backstory, I'm like, well, I want to know more about this character. You've watched movies and TV shows before. You're like, oh, I love this character. I want more screen time with him. And
Mhm.
luckily, I didn't write the whole damn book and then go back and go, it should have been about the suspect number 8. So that's how the project started.
And let me say this. So I've grown up in the church. I'm very active in my church, and so I was really interested to see how I would
Mhm.
take this book. And I tried to explain it to my mom, she is a jumping bean for Jesus. Like, she is very
Mhm.
serious, and she wants to read the book
Mhm.
and not to like discount it, because the way that I try to explain it is like the Bible for is almost like a piece of history,
Mhm.
and that this wasn't meant to discount anything. It is literally fiction.
It is fiction, but I made sure, there's plenty of books out there where, Jesus had a boyfriend, blah blah, Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, and that's low-hanging fruit and really easy. And I wanted to see could I treat this in a responsible, respective manner and still tell a grounded story and really explore characters because the Catholic Church, believes that Jesus was fully human, right? And there's been very little written about him prior to the ministry. So, I had a fun time writing him in just terms of like, what do you do when you've been told you're the son of God, but you haven't really been called to your ministry? But Joseph's like, you got to get out there and work more. And you don't know if you're going to be called tomorrow or 10 years from now. And what goes through somebody's mind? How do you handle that on a day to day? What's your outlook on life? How is it when you have other families that kind of eye you with like, my son should be alive, but he's not because of you, and Herod's thing, years ago. So the book, as you know, is not preachy. Um,
No.
I
Yeah.
do, anything against, Christians has to do with the atrocities that they've committed in Christ's name, and that's all historical fact. And so it's not, and the great thing I've gotten, the feedback I've gotten from is I have people that are in the church. I've had people that went to Catholic girls' schools, and I've had atheists read it, and I have everybody come back to me and go, "Man, this was a great read. It was a
Yeah.
great read. I didn't blaspheme for the sake of blasphemy. I did a different take on the nativity, which, looking back, I'm like, oh, that's very possibly could have happened.
Hmm.
I have a midwife. I introduced a midwife who was at the nativity, right? Because, I didn't think Joseph would be a very good midwife, with this kind of jealousy and his equivocation of, who is the father. Even though I think in the Bible at some point some angel comes down and tells Joseph to lay off on being mean to Mary. I can't remember where that is. So I just thought, oh, how fun would it be to have a midwife who was actually there and to be able to
Yeah.
tell that story.
So
Um,
for me, one part that I did, this book made me think of things
mhm,
that even having grown up in the church, that I never put it in context.
mhm.
Like, so the butcher would have been alive before Christ's birth. So he's lived under Old Testament and New Testament law. So he has seen this change. And I imagine that's part of the reason why he's so cynical. Like, I mean, it's even in my beliefs, it's hard to think that why are all these people dying, and he had to be part of the culling, he had to be part of that, and he still wants to believe that something's good. He really deals a lot with his salvation and redemption.
Yeah, that's the thing, and I think it's because if he joins the culling, and it's however long it was, a fortnight supposedly, um, and he's, to be blunt, he's slaughtered, these newborns, and I threw in the fact that oftentimes they killed females too. They just didn't have time to check sexes. They just did their thing and moved on. Um, and then, I believe King Herod dies literally just a few years later.
Hmm.
So all of this was for nothing, right? And of course, he self-exiles. As you read in the book, he self-exiles to Egypt, and basically sentenced himself to hard labor. Working for a community and building roads. Um, and so when he gets this feverish dream of it's escaped, he feels. I think he feels one part was like he can complete it, and because it's no longer about Herod being challenged, but about what Christ's followers may do in the future, then he sees some value in completing that task, right? But at the same time, we know in the book, and minor spoiler, that his family was kind of broken up and shattered because of that, and so that ends up becoming the other thing. Well, on the back, it talks about him finding a dead newborn and wanting to take that to Christ to have him to resurrect the baby. So you have him torn between his worldwide salvation mission and also something that's, could make his family whole again. Because he's been mourning and feeling this guilt for 30 years. So it goes from him being a little bit of a zealot to finish this job because he sees all these other people he can save are going to be far more numerous than the infants that he put to death. But then here's an opportunity also to have his family back or have a family again. So it's the temptation and the redemption, and as you read along the way that in the second book, the book is broken up into three main books. The Pharisee, like he's a witness to a stoning,
Hmm.
and stoning served their purpose at that time because it was a sense of like if there's a crime in the community, everyone has to participate in punishment, right? It was also to keep people from taking revenge on their own. But stonings are brutal, and I know this is dark, and I don't shy away from that. The camera does not shy away from the violence, much like it doesn't in the Bible. It just you end up getting one or two lines in the Bible about something horrible happening, like Salome dancing before Herod with the head of John the Baptist, right? And you're like, oh, that's horrific, but it's a couple of lines and end up being a couple of paintings. But he starts to see the communal violence that potentially he understands how people can later do these other bigger atrocities because they've seen a small community of people that know each other participate in the stoning of one of their own,
Hmm.
right? So that kind of causes him doubt of like, ooh, maybe these people aren't worth saving. So it's a, I was really happy with the Butcher in terms of the complexity of him. You know, it could have been very easy to make him a mustache twirling. He's just an assassin, but I didn't want to do that.
No, he struggles the entire time with
Yeah.
what's real. And back to the stoning part, like again, that's something that I've always known was happening, but I never thought that's Chunk. I never, he's so big. I never thought about how brutal that really was. It never occurred to me how mean it is to have been stoned. And these scenes are like when that bone hits a head, and how the people would have taken time, or the stone hits it, how the people would have been very specific to pick out what they can throw.
Yeah. Yeah. And women and children participated too.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's horrific. And, you know, and like you, I've read about stonings and I've seen, you know, movies or, you know, where there's a brief scene or whatever. Um, but, you know, when you actually think about what it takes to kill someone by stoning, if you don't get a headshot right away,
Hmm.
bones break, skin gets torn, bleeding, you know, you're not going to lay there. You're going to try to crawl to get away from it like an animal. It's just brutal. It's just brutal. And that really, honestly, when I was writing, when I wrote that scene, that's when I was like, oh, this is going to cause a seed of doubt in the butcher because it's causing a seed of doubt for me as a writer about his mission, seeing this, you know. And also I wanted to set up a situation where, you know, possibly, you know, the butcher is subject to a stoning or, you know, sentenced to something like that too. So you see how awful it is to begin with, but it carries on. You
Yeah.
know, the thought of that carries on, especially when you have youngsters are trying to pick up rocks and like the dad gives his son a rock, but it's too heavy for him. And the kid doesn't even know why the man's being punished because they were late, but he wants to make sure he doesn't miss his chance to cast a stone. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there were some scenes I came along in writing that really changed the trajectory of either the plot or the arc of the butcher, and that was
I
definitely
think that those doubts too, that's what when I try and talk about it, like to my mom, for example, said what this book will do is whether you're a Christian or an atheist or somewhere in between, this is going to cause a lot of conversations.
yes,
You can really talk about every piece and the doubt and why, and do you have faith, or what do you believe in, or I mean I mean it is. It's that for me was all over the place. Like I got him and then I was mad at him because of what I know is on the other side. But then do I know what's on the other side?
yeah, yeah. I had a few readers reach out to me, you know, a couple fans and a couple just, you know, writers in the community were just like, man, I was so rooting for the butcher. Like I know I should, you know, I was raised in the church, but I was so his reasoning and rationale, like I was right there. And then when it's kind of his mission changes, and it's a bit, then I was rooting for him too because I have a family, and you know I've had a death in the family recently, and I know what that grief can do to someone, and I've seen it, and so it is. So it, I mean, he's a fully three-dimensional character, and again, it was a really as a process of discovery. And, you know, and quite honest with you, you know, I've had a very tumultuous relationship with my father, and it kind of came to a head a few years ago. So the whole fathers and sons thing, how do you, you know, different, you know, Joseph with, you know, his say adopted son, Jesus, and then you have Jesus is trying to have a relationship with the Lord, but the Lord's not really speaking to him. And then you have somebody that lost a baby, and then you have, you know, somebody, you know, it opens with them finding the youth, the dead youth in the camp, right? And
Mhm.
his father really can't be bothered to bury him or mourn for him, and kind of bribes the butcher to take care of the body, right? And that kind of
Right.
where the butcher's just like, how can you do this to your son? How can you just abandon him like this?
Yeah.
Because you've got to go on to business. You've got to get to Jerusalem in time to set up your tent. You know what? You know,
Yeah.
so it so there are different shades and there's different. You know, everybody sees the relationship between a father and son differently, and obviously there's mothers and sons are in there as well. But for me, the father son probably resonated the most just because of my situation.
Well, the internal battle for redemption salvation, I think, is a holy fright, Chunk. Shh. You're gonna go to bed. Quit. Is it was like, I mean, and even having, I think anybody who is a Christian, they fought with their faith and with their beliefs and whether it's true or not, or is God going to talk to me now? Like it just, I just would like this. So my rule of thumb kind of is, if my mom can't read it and my preacher can't read it, I'm probably not going to read it. And I'm
Mhm.
telling you, I'm going to show my preacher this book. I'm going to say, oh, check this out, because it's
Yeah.
like there's just things that I didn't expect to see.
Right.
So
Right.
okay, so
Yeah.
I have a really weird question.
Okay.
The
Ask me a really good question.
fonts in the book. So, and I know that's kind of weird. So, part of my annotations are when things would change and the font would change, or there would be one word here and there. I'm probably really just telling on myself, like bloodlust, and then it'll go on for a minute. I literally tried to pick out a pattern and then go back through and make them make something else. Did I miss it? Did it do
So
that?
they're in the opening when the vision flashbacks are in italics, right?
Yeah.
And anything that's a flashback or a little bit of a jump back and backfill is in italics. If it's a if it's a foreign word like Seiken, like the blade that the
Yeah.
kosher butchers use, then I kept that in italics. And then just sometimes it's for emphasis.
So that was one thing. So I would start picking them out, and then I tried to put them in a pattern. Like I tried to, I was like, there's a hidden message here. I'm like digging now.
I love books like that. I have done stuff like that, but this one for me was like, okay, just tell the story. You can do mini flashbacks to fill in some stuff, and there is a tense change here and there from present tense to past tense that happens once or twice, and hopefully it's subtle. It's just to kind of enhance the reading. But yeah, no, there's no hidden messages. There's no backmasking in this. But good for you because I am a sucker for that. I will start looking at the first letter of every sentence. Does that form a word?
Yeah.
But this one I just wanted it to be text based. And
Okay. Well, I'm glad I didn't miss it. I thought I
no,
missed
no,
it because I
you
was
didn't miss
trying
any. No,
every
you didn't
way.
miss anything. You didn't miss
Uh,
anything.
And another thing that really threw me off were the bees, and I'm wondering if I've missed something about the two types of bees.
The two types of bees. So uh, a thing I learned years ago is that in the Middle East, beekeeping is like uh, people keeping dogs, right? It's pets and honey
Hmm.
for merchants and stuff. So Jesus has his apiary, where because he loves bees, right? And he
Hmm.
loves honey, right? He's got a sweet tooth. But that the bees that the butcher brings him, and this is not really a spoiler, but brings Jesus is from that caravan, and they were a different breed of bees,
Hmm.
are much more aggressive. And so when that urn gets cracked open, and they kind of wreak havoc on Jesus apiary. So that's
Okay.
the thing. And the venom's a little stronger, which puts Jesus at risk at one point. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's two types of bees: the ones he keeps, and then the foreign bees that the butcher inadvertently brings into Nazareth in the second half of the book.
What made you decide to go to? I mean, you are okay. Let me back up and ask like this: does it bother you when people get mad at what you've written?
Uh, no, I I've had zero backlash on this book, which I don't know if it's just that the right readers are getting it right now,
Hmm.
and people read it and go, yeah, you might think it's blasphemous, but it's really not, and it's thought provoking. And like I said, I've had a couple of reviews point out like he doesn't bash religion, he doesn't advocate for it. It's just people dealing with their belief systems, because that's not the point of the book is to grapple with your belief systems, right?
Right.
One of my lines in there that kind of come out of nowhere when you're writing, and you're just when you look back on it pleased is Jesus asks, what happens when two righteous men face off, right? They both wholeheartedly believe what they're doing is right. This
Yeah.
person wholeheartedly believes what they're doing is right. And what does that clash look like? And that's any good story, right? The bad guy has to believe he's the hero of his story. And there's no mustache twirling, but it's like, you have to believe in what you believe, and then sometimes you have to stand up and fight for it, even though you're looking at the other person's belief and going, how could you possibly think that? Like, it
Hmm.
doesn't make sense in my brain. Those dots don't connect that way. um the stuff I've had, like the fountain was very, very tricky. many points of view, many characters, a lot of footnotes for fun. And, I had some people come back and go, oh, this book was terrible. It was boring. Or I didn't, it wasn't my cup of tea. And that's fine. And not safe for work, which is very experimental. The people that read it loved it.
Mhm.
And it's opened some doors for me. But a lot of people are like, yeah, I don't get it. Not for me, too experimental, too weird, too gross. And those kind of reviews are actually selling points for people that are like, this book is weird and gross. That's for me, right? But I
Yeah.
haven't, so far with The Butcher, I haven't had anybody come back and get mad. I did have one person on Instagram when I was promoting the book, did because the synopsis on the back talks about a pre-ministry obese Jesus.
Hmm.
Like, why is Jesus obese? And I was like, well, that's a spoiler, but it's not random. There's a reason for it. And he was like, well, what's the reason? And I'm just like, nope, that's it.
Yeah.
So, I have a tendency to I'll respond to everybody, but if I get the sense that somebody's looking to pick a fight that hasn't read the book or even
Right.
any of the reviews, then I just ignore.
But it's still fiction. Like I just want to say, like, and we don't know that he wasn't obese. We don't have that knowledge that he wasn't. So, um, so this for me too, like I think a lot of readers put horror in a very small thing. Like they want a slasher, they want a jump scare, they want like all of these things. And so I feel like this is different than
Mhm.
I didn't have it was visceral. It was but the for me the horror was more of a mental battle. It was more of the outcome of all of these things, some of which are very true,
Mhm.
like very and where it's going to go. To me, the unknown is the scary part.
Right. Right. And that's the second part of horror, right? First part is the unknown. The second part for me is having something you love being taken away and powerless to do anything about it, right? Which, the butcher faces that in spades. Um, I'm I'm a horror writer, I guess, for this book, but I joined the Horror Writers Association a couple of years ago and suddenly found myself on the short story jury for the Bram Stoker. And, I think I read probably 350 stories that year. And I was new to horror, not safe for work. We market it as horror adjacent, but again, it's not slasher. It's not this. And I was gobsmacked and delighted at the breadth of subgenres. I'm actually gonna when we do the book release for the Butcher next week in New York, we're also doing an anthology feast. Um, that has like 25 stories, and they're everything from small towns to cosmic horror to more fables. It just you can do horror westerns, you can do any kind of genre and add a horror element to it.
Hmm.
And i knew with I knew with the Butcher that I was going to be doing historical fiction and exploring religious themes and redemption and salvation, which are redemption ends up being a huge theme throughout most of my work. um, but I also knew that I wanted it to slot right there with other horror books, right? But not in the way you think. And because the Bible is brutal and there's sex in the Bible as well, Song of Solomon, right?
Hmm.
That I wanted to have that in there as well. And I didn't want people to like your mom or your preacher might read the book and be like, oh, that's a little gruesome. But that's we're talking about those times, and that's the way things happened, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
there's a version of the Butcher that I thank God nobody's asked me to do yet, where that the violence is tempered down, and I just don't see it being the same kind of story without it, right?
yeah,
You need that trauma, right? You need that visceral trauma, and you need to be able to experience. And I think because of the historical part of it, there is a little bit of distance built in anyway. And also, like you said, you've read about stonings. This is, oh, they did stonings as whatever. But then to actually kind of witness one up close and personal, you're like, oh, this is not, this is not, this is not right. This is not good. And you can understand. And then being kind of coerced to like, well, Teresa, you got to go along. We're going to stone old Joe. Joe was coveting his wife, and now here's a rock, and you got to participate. You have to.
yeah, yeah,
And I'm sure some people delight in it, like the one character, the British man. Uh, but um, but yeah, but you put yourself in that kind of situation, which is always the great thing about something that's historical or even horror, where you're like, what would you do? What choice would you make, right? And that's tougher when it's that you have less options gender wise and cultural wise, right? There's so much more pressure to conform to those roles, especially in that time, you know.
Was there something specific in this book that you found the hardest to write?
That's a great question. Um,
I'm just gonna fist bump myself for stumping you. Oh.
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think if there was I, spoiler alert, the butcher dispatches of somebody in the first book whom we get really kind of close to. And um I always knew that that was going to happen eventually.
Hmm.
And when I got there, I felt like I had done my work because that was hard to do.
Yeah.
That was hard to do. I had the same thing happen in the fountain where one of my favorite characters meets an untimely demise in service of the plot, of course. And when it came, I was like, and I had, some people like, dude, why? Why'd you do that? I was like, well, we have to, and it fits in with the, I had to. Otherwise, it's not a horror book, right? Or otherwise, it's not, the art doesn't resonate and the art that comes from trauma and grief doesn't resonate. That was probably probably the hardest of like, oh man, this is the part of the job I hate. The I was saying not the hardest, but the scene I took, and this might surprise you. The scene I took the most time with was when, okay, so you have the midwife who is there at the nativity, right? And every
Hmm.
so often she gets these, the descendants of the three wise men come to town, they pay her trinkets, and then she kind of reenacts and tells the story of the nativity, right?
Hmm.
Because the three wise men are like, oh, we were there, we saw the baby Jesus, and she's here, and you can go see her. So they go in when she reenacts in that barn, the nativity, that was that took me that scene took it probably took you 10 minutes to read and it took me probably a week to write because I did her monologue, her story, right? And then
Hmm.
because they're paying for this performance, I have to add a little bit of blocking. I can't have it static with the folks listening, so I had her bring forth one of the princes and one of the princesses, right, to as stand-ins for Jesus and Joseph. And then you have the kid who's a little unruly, and then you got the translator. And so you had to have their responses and how they're acting as an audience unruly before they settle in. Um, and then I had to go in and layer in the butcher standing at the back, who is just like, if these folks are really descendants of the three wise men, I have to take them out.
Hmm.
So, and then of course, havoc breaks loose. But that chapter. It took me a long. I thought I could write it in a day or two, and like I said, it probably took me a week. But it was really nice to layer it in, and the discovery of the nativity, and then you find out later she'd fudged some stuff that we find out. That was, I wouldn't say the hardest, but that was the one I spent the most time on. For me, that's the most thing like a painting that's in there.
I would say that this book is cinematic, like you watch it play out as it goes. So knowing that, well, we live in 2026 and you're writing in 14 to 20, 14 to, what are we up to 19 or 0003 to about 32? What are
Yeah.
about them? Was it hard to place things like with the language, with their habits, with all of the things to make it so realistic?
My previous book, Not Safe for Work, takes place like next month, like very near
Hmm.
future. So it's tech. There's been this colossal hack that has happened. These social media moderators are trying to make, they're watching the worst of the worst for 90 days to try to get health insurance. They're dealing with trauma. They're, the couple that meets during this training, gets rid of all their furniture and turns their living room into this big terrarium. They bring in sod and plants. And so just so much tech and this new phone that's coming out that's actually powered by human touch, right? um, so for me to get rid of all that technology, all those metaphors, all the current events, and to go back was so refreshing.
Oh,
but it required an amazing amount of research. I don't know if I'd say I might have sent
you
you
did.
there.
Yeah.
Like here's and I had an illustrated Bible. I had this children's Jewish illustrated Bible. I had like here's all the maps and timelines, and the maps were indispensable because I had to figure out the butcher's path, right? Which thank goodness was
Hmm.
mostly northern, so that really saved my initial idea. Um, but I wrote a list of like, okay, what's the commerce? What's the diet? What are the typical gender roles? What are some of the cultural things I need to keep intact? Of course, they have the Roman occupation. What is currency? Again, what's the diet? What's the mode of travel? I wrote out questions for myself to fill it in and to add, what do the houses look like? Right.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of research, and not everything makes it in. It was just like as needed to kind of make it realistic without like, hey, here's 5,000 words of research I did that I want to put in the book. So that was enlightening and fun because you just everybody basically it's like you cook over a fire, and sometimes you have meat and sometimes you don't, and you walk everywhere, or you have a cart, and all the interactions are face to face. Nobody's text messaging, nobody is on the phone. If you're buying something, there's a negotiation of price. It's not like they're scanning prices. So it actually was really kind of a relief because everything that happened had to be face to face, right? And there
Yeah.
wasn't any shortcuts. You couldn't drive somewhere. Even if you had to travel 6 miles by goat, there's still things that can happen to you. So it was actually a relief not to deal with any modern technology, but it did require a large amount of research. And fun fact, I was lucky enough to get the opening section to AC Weiss, who wrote Wendy Darling,
Hmm.
and she read the opening thing, and at one point I have the butcher feeding the goat, his beast that pulls the cart, a carrot, and I have it discolors his teeth orange. And she's just like, "Hey, fun fact: orange carrots weren't around until the late 18th century. It was a Dutch hybrid of white and red carrots." I was like, "Oh my God, okay, let me go back
Yeah.
and change that." And she's like, "I don't know how I know that. I just thought I'd pass that along." So there was a draft where I went through the arc you have, and you're very generous with your response to it. But there are words in there that I had to go through afterwards and comb out, that like hoodwinked is like 16th century, pregnant wasn't around until 14th century. There were other things that I just kind of had to sweep through instead of making the text archaic, that it was readable and smooth. And that was the
Hmm.
whole thing, was just to make it not have you really bump on any words unless it was necessary for the story.
We didn't even talk about the goat. What was the nugget for the goat? Where did he come from?
The nugget for the goat. The nugget for the goat.
It's hard to talk about the goat without giving anything away.
The goat. I love the goat. I love that people love the goat. Honestly, okay, so once I decided to do this thing with the butcher, you have a story brain. Like I'm reading, I'm watching, I'm doing all this other stuff, and like, oh, if I did that, I would do this better. If I did this, I would do that better. Two things with the goat. I watched The Witch, Robert Edgers,
Hmm.
and they have a goat in there that attacks someone. And the part of that movie is like, is it the goat, or are the witches in the forest doing the attack, right? And they have
Yeah.
the nursery rhyme about Black Phillip. And for me personally, I was like, it's got to be the goat. I don't want her to be a witch. I want it to be the goat. And if I did that movie, it would be the goat. And then I saw a clip of a goat. I don't know that if he had rabies, but there was something wrong with him, and he was walking on his hind feet.
Hmm.
And that image to me was like, that is scary, right?
Yeah.
Just kind of like filed that away. So I was like, I'm going to have a goat. I don't know what I'm going to do with him. I don't know how he's going to play into it. And it ended up being a really fun to write the mischievous goat. Uh, and also, he rides into Nazareth on the goat. So it's kind of a mirror image of Jesus riding into town on a donkey. So
Right. Right. So between have you got the new book? You have a book coming out about AI and tech. Where do you prefer to land, or do you have a
well, Not
preference?
Safe for Work came out a couple of years ago. Um, and the butcher comes out, next week. I don't, I don't know that I could write another book like Not Safe for Work, dealing with the tech and social media and videos and AI and all these social media companies and stuff. I spent so much time immersed in that world.
Hmm.
Oh, and here's a fun little fact. I did a reading of Not Safe for Work at the Bay Area Book Fest, and I had this woman in line uh, who didn't have a copy of my book, right? But she wanted to speak with me. So, you're like, okay, this is going to be bad or this is going to be really good, right? And she asked me, she goes, have you ever worked for Facebook? And I was like, no, I just did a lot of research. She goes, I did. I was the mental health coach for social media moderators. And I was like, what kind of training did you get for that? And she said, none. And she goes, their idea of mental health was the laptop that had videos dealing with children was set aside with two large houseplants on either side to make
Hmm.
you comfortable. And I was like, that sounds horrific. And she goes, yeah, she goes, whatever research you did, you got it right. And I was like, I'm assuming you do not want a copy of this book. And she goes, no, but I wanted to tell you that you nailed it. So, uh, and I think people are kind of overwhelmed with AI and the tech, and I know more people are disconnecting and going back to reading books. So, um, I have two possible projects coming up next. One is more of a contemporary religious horror.
Hmm.
Um, and I wouldn't have done it if I didn't have two or three big ideas that I think could kind of carry it. So I'm exploring that one, and then I have another one where I do more of a slipstream, which I guess is kind of like Not Safe for Work. It's more of a PKD, Philip K. Dick slipstream novel, set in the near future, a little bit more, authoritarian. Divorce by combat, right? Kind of like you can't divorce unless you challenge someone to combat, or you can just do an amicable divorce, but you're stuck in a single tax bracket for the rest of your life, right? It's kind of like what the Republicans, Democrats, the kind of the treaty they worked out. So there's some fun stuff with that. I don't, and I got a potential new publisher interested in something like that, so we'll see. But I've had a few people actually reach out and like, are you going to do another biblical horror book? Like, this is my jam. This is good.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know. I mean, if I have a big idea, maybe, I'm like, what do you want? You want Noah's boat to see a pirate ship arc? And then we go from there? Like, maybe, I don't know. But this one kind of was very satisfying. And I don't know that I could top it. I don't want to be one of those guys that wrote a great biblical horror novel and then, writes four more that are like, meh.
Yeah.
Look, there's no cash cows in the indie world, right? So, but I've got some ideas, but I think the modern day horror one that I'm kind of noodling on. I think that one actually might stick because I've got some big ideas, and that one like your mom and your preacher probably would not want to read. But maybe, but maybe, but maybe. But that one definitely takes some ideas and makes them a little bit more concrete as opposed to just, are we going to be, is God speaking to me or not?
Yeah. I think this book will it's either gonna, I think it will stick around. I think it's gonna be talked about for a long time. I think this is a
Oh,
book
thank
that
you.
you need to read slow. I think you need to unpack it. I think you need to argue with yourself. I think you need to research it and see what it is and keep in mind that it is fiction, but it has the fodder for the things that we didn't think about, whether you grew up in church or you didn't.
Right.
It's those stories that you knew happened. They're back there somewhere, and you wrote a book. And I mean, it's there's just a continual battle between so many things.
Mhm.
And I think it's just really, I really enjoyed it. It was not an easy read at all. It wasn't. And I like that though.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Teresa, because I know I didn't want people to easily dismiss it,
Hmm.
depending on which side of or where you're at on your religious or faith spectrum. I didn't want it to just, and I wanted to really explore those characters as characters
Hmm.
grounded, in a really grounded way. How would I feel if I was Jesus and had not been called? And I want to get
Hmm.
married, and and how would it be being the mother of a son is going to probably be taken away from you at some point, and the Pharisee, right, who taught Jesus, and he hasn't heard from him, and I've been forgotten, and there's just and the midwife too, who's just spend her life trying to bolster Bethlehem with trying to turn something a bad something that was a bad experience in her life into something positive, and which is what we all try to do. So in that terms, I didn't want the religion to actually even be a question. It's just like
Yeah.
this is what this person believes. This person is what this is waiting on. Um, oh, fun fact, going back about the research, one of the things I read that really kind of made me laugh and teehee was, of course, my understanding is that the Gospels were written probably about 80 years after they happened, right?
Hmm.
Well, one of the books I was reading uh, kind of suggested that beards weren't actually fashionable at the time of Jesus, but because they were written 80 years after when beards were fashionable, they gave Jesus a beard.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
painting someone had of Jesus kind of like in Roman garb, but clean shaven, that was done about that time. And so you're like, oh, okay. This is okay. This kind of throws everything. If just one historical fact, like what can I do with that? And of course, that comes into play. I didn't let that fact go to waste. Um, so it's just that interesting perspective of like, well, here you're going to get a different shot of Jesus that's not going to shock you, that's going to make you think, but is not your white Western oil painting that hangs in all these churches, right?
Hmm.
So I'm not sure if there was a question in there, but that was an answer.
Well, I appreciate you talking with me. I really do.